We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Of the United States rivals to the rebalancing. I've already mentioned China, there's Russia as well, and we will also look at the impact of the rebalancing on the strategic balance in the Middle East. So without further ado, I will yield the floor to my colleague, Professor Stéphanie Martel, who will be moderating the first panel. Stéphanie, over to you.
Merci, Jonathan, pour cette introduction.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this introduction. I hope that you can all hear me. So thank you as well to the whole team that is making this event possible this morning. Thank you to all of you for being with us for this first panel on the U.S. pivot in Asia from the perspective of Washington's allies.
Thank you for joining us for the first panel of the day on the strategic pivot and U.S. allies' responses. My name is Stéphanie Martel. I'm an assistant professor of political studies at Queen's University, and I will have the pleasure of chairing discussions this morning. Our panelists will all be presenting in English today, and so this is the language I will be using to chair the discussion, but members of the audience should feel free to ask their questions in the language they prefer. When I restate them for the panel, or translation services should be able to take care of the rest. So to ask a question when we open up to questions from the audience, please make sure to click on the Q&A tab and not the chat function and ask your question in there. I will ask panelists to keep their remarks under 20 minutes and as close to the 15-minute mark as they can, so we can have ample time for questions. And they will present in the order they are listed on the program. So it is my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Rachel Esplin-Odell. She is a research fellow in the East Asia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and an expert in US strategy towards Asia, Chinese foreign policy, and maritime security. She holds a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Odell previously worked as a research analyst in the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she served in the China Affairs Bureau of the Office of the US Trade Representative. So Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to participate in this conference, in this workshop, and I look forward to engaging with all of you in the Q&A and hearing from my fellow panelists. So what I'll be doing today is addressing the pivot then and now, how it emerged and how it's evolved over time. And I'll conclude with some of my assessments. But to begin, I want to somewhat complicate our understanding of what the pivot is and how it's evolved over time. And of course, in common discourse, the pivot is most often thought of as the US effort announced by US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in October 2011 in an article in Foreign Policy magazine entitled America's Pacific Century, and engineered by then Assistant Secretary of State Kurt Campbell, who is now, of course, the Indo-Pacific coordinator on Biden's National Security Council. Its main components included stronger diplomatic engagement by more senior officials, economic negotiations in the region, particularly through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as well as a shift in the military balance or in the way that the United States was apportioning its military forces in the world, as announced by Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, where the United States would rebalance towards the Asia Pacific with 60% of its forces oriented towards that region. And this is sort of the common narrative of the pivot. And of course, another very important feature of the pivot was what was being pivoted away from. It, of course, reflected a strong preference for America's shifting attention away from the Middle East, reflecting the assessment of the Obama administration that the center of gravity in world politics in the 21st century was the Asia-Pacific region. And of course, the opening line of Clinton's essay in the Foreign Policy stated, as the war in Iraq winds down and America begins to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, the United States stands at a pivot point. So, the very framing of the pivot was in many ways about a desire of the United States to get out of the Middle East during the Obama administration. Now, I think that this characterization is, of course, at some level, an accurate characterization. But what I argue is that the pivot, as commonly conceived, was actually more than anything an effort to claim a new grand strategic narrative for the United States after a decade of failed policy and war in the Middle East. And in many ways, you could say that it was actually a label that was applied to an underlying structural shift that was already underway, but had been somewhat sort of sidetracked due to the 9/11 attacks and the global war on terror. So the remarks that I'll give today are based in part on a research paper that I wrote with Casey Miura, who is a former colleague of mine at MIT and is now an assistant professor at the University of San Diego, informed by a combination of elite interviews we did with senior US foreign policymakers, as well as their memoirs and primary accounts. And it's also reflected in part on a report I wrote with my Quincy Institute colleagues, Michael Swain and Jessica Lee, that we published last month, called Toward an Inclusive and Balanced Regional Order, a New US Strategy in East Asia. So I think that in order to understand this broader argument that I'm making, that in many ways the pivot was a grand strategic narrative that was actually sort of applied to an underlying structural shift that was already underway and had sort of been momentarily sidetracked. I think it's important to look back to an earlier period before this, this pivot narrative emerged, to the Bush administration, and it is definitely the case that in many ways the Bush administration did not prioritize East Asia, but this wasn't so much a deliberate decision, again, as a consequence of the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror that it then engaged in. And in fact, and Nina Seelov, a professor at the Australian National University, has written an article on this as well, based on research she did in archival materials and with administration officials, with Bush administration officials. And in many ways, the Defense Department, under especially Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, really did initially seek to elevate the Asia Pacific, or you could say pivot to Asia, as the focus of US efforts to maintain military dominance globally. But those efforts were derailed, much to Rumsfeld's dismay, by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where he did not want to prioritize war fighting. And in fact, scholars of that conflict have argued that that's part of why the US efforts in Iraq foundered, is because of his lack of interest in sort of dedicating the level of forces that might have been necessary to prevent the initial destruction in Baghdad and beyond that took place when there was insufficient security after the initial invasion. So in any event, there had been this desire to shift militarily. So that didn't end up happening. However, I think it's easy also to then exaggerate the degree to which the United States was inattentive in the Asia Pacific. In many ways, the military presence in the Asia Pacific during the Bush administration remained on autopilot. Yes, there were fewer presence operations, freedom navigation operations by the military in those years, and many of the forces that were stationed in that region were sort of being cycled out to serve in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there was no fundamental restructuring or drawdown of the US military presence in Asia. And looking beyond the military domain, in many ways, the Bush administration, especially in the second administration, actually did engage in significant economic and diplomatic engagement in the region. This took place in the form of, for example, negotiation of bilateral trade agreements with South Korea and Singapore and New Zealand, and it also included efforts to join what was the precursor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is oftentimes thought of as an Obama initiative, but it actually began during the Bush years as they sought to expand what was a pre-existing Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership Agreement among Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore. So the Bush administration really prioritized trade engagement in the region, and it also did prioritize significantly increasing engagement with China through a strategic economic dialogue. And of course, China joined the WTO in late 2001, early in the Bush administration. And the Treasury and Commerce Departments established these regular dialogues with China and sought to elevate the importance they placed there. So there was a significant amount of engagement in Asia, just reflecting the growing economic significance in particular of the region, even in the Bush years. And then the Obama administration came into office with a very different attitude towards the conflicts in the Middle East. So in many ways, the pivot in the Obama years at a grand strategic level also emerged from the very outset. It wasn't just something that took place in late 2011. And this was evident early on when the earliest visits by the Obama administration abroad by key Obama officials were to the Asia Pacific, and including President Obama himself when he visited Asia, early in his term and did a state visit to China in November of 2009 or December in late 2009. And the Obama administration joined or elevated its participation in various regional fora, such as the East Asia Summit. And then it continued efforts begun in the Bush administration to conclude new bilateral and multilateral economic agreements, finalizing the trade deal with South Korea and negotiating expanded TPP. So at the same time, the Obama administration really also sought to deepen diplomatic engagement with Beijing, again, that had been initiated during the Bush years. It rebranded the Strategic Economic Dialogue to the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, but sort of portrayed it as a new effort, and it was deepened in some ways and expanded to include more of on the diplomatic side in the State Department, not just only Treasury and Commerce. And that these efforts were portrayed as, in many ways, a desire to shift U.S. attention to Asia. But again, that attention was there to some extent already. It was more an effort for the Obama administration to emphasize that it didn't want to spend as much time in the Middle East as it had. Now, why do we then think of the pivot as not really emerging until 2011? This has to do with disagreements within the Obama team about the role that Asia, or sorry, about the distinctions within the Asia Pacific strategy and where the emphasis should be placed. So officials that initially led out an Asia Pacific strategy were Deputy Secretary of State James Steinberg and Asia Director on the National Security Council, Jeffrey Bader. And then, of course, at the same time, we had Secretary of State Clinton and also Assistant Secretary of State Kurt Campbell. And they all were basically on the same page about this need to pivot to Asia. And Obama, this is reflecting Obama's preferences as well. But the former officials, Bader and Steinberg, believed that you had to get China right. You had to get the U.S.-China relationship right and really emphasize the need for cooperation with China. And the latter officials, Secretary Clinton and Assistant Secretary Campbell, emphasized the relationships with allies within that framework. But in that early part of the Obama years, the former officials were able to sort of lead out, and they emphasized this engagement with China first. And Secretary of State Clinton and Assistant Secretary of State Campbell were on board with this, and they also made a lot of sort of early signals that they were seeking to engage China. But then over the course of that first year and a half of the Obama administration, this objective really sort of foundered on the realities of politics, of changing politics in China and at a global scale. And you can't really understand how the pivot evolved and changed from sort of a more positive sum emphasis on engagement with countries throughout the region, including China, towards a somewhat more hard-edged, containment-oriented strategy, without understanding two key interrelated factors. One of which was, of course, the 2008-2009 global financial crisis that was in full bloom when Obama came into office, and also the ongoing changes in Chinese domestic politics that in many ways were directly catalyzed by that global financial crisis. So I won't go into too much detail here, but the basic argument in this paper I wrote with my colleague Casey Miura is that the the reasons why this shift in the pivot, the pivot within the pivot, you could argue, although that is that the reason why that shift happened was because on the Chinese side, there was not really the situation in Chinese politics at the time. The Obama administration sought to engage in more cooperative overtures towards China that made it so that Chinese politicians at a senior level were not prepared really to reciprocate. And in fact, were quite there was a significant degree of internal dissension within China over how China should respond to the global financial crisis, how it should respond to American overtures, and what its future foreign policy should be. This was the waning years of the Hu Jintao administration, and there was a major debate going on over whether peaceful rise should continue to be the guiding line in Chinese foreign policy. And this debate was in full bloom, and eventually by late 2010, Dai Bingguo, who was then the state counselor over foreign affairs, would issue an essay that did in fact reassert peaceful rise, and was meant to sort of tamp down on that debate to some extent. However, due to both that as well as dissension in broader domestic politics ahead of the leadership transition that was starting to unfold, there wasn't a significant degree of political will behind engaging with the United States in cooperative ways. And this was most noteworthy at the Copenhagen climate negotiations, where President Obama was placing a high priority on cooperation with China and other countries in that forum, but China did not send particularly high-level representation, and it didn't really have a strategy for engaging in productive ways at that conference. And that proved particularly disillusioning to President Obama, as well as he was somewhat frustrated about how his state visit to China went in late 2009. And then there were a variety of other factors that played into this, including accelerating tensions in the South China Sea and Taiwan arms sales and a Dalai Lama visit. And there were a number of events during this period that sort of undermined the argument of those in the administration that favored a less zero-sum pivot. And over the next year, they would become sort of increasingly marginalized, and by mid-2011, both Bader and Steinberg left the administration. And that sort of paved the way for, in late 2011, the rollout of the pivot as we now conceive of it. And even then, of course, the pivot maintained an emphasis on cooperative relations with Beijing in areas of shared interest, and that kind of cooperation did continue in coming years, and a number of agreements were reached between China and the United States, and especially the national security advisors and officials within the White House, Susan Rice, Tom Donilon, continue to prioritize that. But nonetheless, there were then accelerating tensions, and Clinton and Campbell placed a stronger emphasis on the building the alliances part, which was inevitably perceived by China as somewhat more threatening. And of course, this was also then accompanied by announcements of air-sea battle and by Secretary Panetta's announcement of a military rebalancing to the Asia Pacific, Marines being stationed in Darwin, and various forms of security assistance to Vietnam and the Philippines, and increased security cooperation agreements with those countries that contributed to that feeling in China that this was a more zero-sum approach. And so, and it wasn't only military. There also was an effort by the Treasury Department to undermine the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and to really actively lobby against this China-founded initiative, which, to lobby against it with American allies such as the United Kingdom and a lot of countries that, didn't see the AIIB as necessarily in zero-sum terms. So this is sort of where the pivot evolved and how during the Obama years. Now, if we look into the Trump administration, during this period, the trend that was already underway in the Obama years has accelerated and continued to become more zero-sum in nature. And this was driven by a shift in broader attitudes in Washington toward Beijing that had already begun. And this perception was that that U.S. security strategy should focus on intensifying great power competition, in part because China, Washington's policy toward China of engagement and hedging was in most respects a failure in liberalizing or democratizing China and hadn't prevented the PRC from becoming more aggressive and adversarial. So this produced what Jonathan referred to, of course, as the Indo-Pacific strategy, which the Trump administration declassified towards the end of its time in office. And it was centered around the concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which had previously been articulated in Japanese politics and was not meant to be as zero-sum as the Trump administration came to frame it. And it wasn't necessarily meant to exclude China originally. And indeed, some Trump administration officials, such as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Chad Srajia for China, didn't frame it in exclusive terms. They sought to frame it in more inclusive terms. But for the most part, Trump administration officials framed this as a form of building an ideological coalition and a sort of on-the-ground coalition in conjunction with the Quad in order to push back against what they perceived as Chinese aggression. So to conclude, this is, I think this account of how the pivot has evolved over time can suggest some important conclusions, some important implications, which is that in many ways, rather than being driven by incisive political insight and change, U.S. strategy towards Asia has been sort of reactive to broader structural change, namely the global distribution of power being centered more in the Asia Pacific, and China's rise in particular, including its growing economic power in the region and its growing military power. And the fact that this is challenging the United States' longstanding position in the region. And the United States is reacting to that in ways where it's trying to reestablish the kind of dominance and influence that it once had. But I think the concern is that in so doing, many of the reactions the United States many of the policies the United States is putting in place are more reactive than really exercising foresight about what the long range or the long-term direction of trends in Asia is, and how do you deal with these trends, including the reality of Chinese power and the reality that countries in the region are now much more economically dependent upon China than they are in the United States, and the reality that they don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. So I think that's the challenge facing the Biden administration, is how to craft a strategy that hedges against some of the potential risks from Chinese power, but also does not force countries that don't want to be forced and will not be forced into a global binary Cold War-like great power competition.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this excellent overview of the pivot. I really appreciate also the chronological breakdown to launch discussion this morning. This is excellent. So our second panelist now is Jonathan Berkshire Miller. He is an international affairs professional with expertise on security, defense, and intelligence issues. He is a senior fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs, deputy director and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and founder and director of the Council of International Policy in Ottawa. Miller also worked on economic and security issues related to Asia within the federal government. And I have the pleasure to work alongside him as well to represent Canada within the ASEAN Regional Forum's Expert and Eminent Persons Group. So the virtual floor is yours, Jonathan.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to Jonathan, the organizers, and all my fellow panelists, many of which are friends, and I enjoyed your insights, Rachel, and I'm sure that I'll enjoy the insights of those who go after me. So, let me try to be brief, and I very much hope that not only my session, but this whole panel becomes a conversation, because as Stephanie mentioned at the onset, we very much want to hear your views as well. There is no sort of one answer or solution to this, but I will commend the organizers for organizing this very unique and important kind of conference. Very seldom do we get the chance to look back and reflect, especially now with this 24/7 news cycle. It seems that we're constantly going from one fire to the next, and we rarely get the chance to actually think back a bit. So one of the things I enjoyed about my previous panelists' comments were the fact that she actually looked back not only at the different articulations of how the pivot was called and framed, but also even before the pivot was the pivot, because I think that kind of segues very nicely into my first point, which is US policy in the Asia Pacific, now framed in the Indo-Pacific, has traditionally been much more of a continuation than some sort of revolution. It's constantly evolved. And I think it's important to think about the different terminology. I think, as Jonathan mentioned in his opening comments, there was some discussion to move the language from pivot to rebalance, just because the wording of pivot seemed to be a bit more security centric. But the reality is that many of the nuts and bolts and pillars, shared interests and values of the pivot towards the rebalance, towards now free and open Indo-Pacific framing from the Trump administration have been consistent. So I think that that part is important. As Rachel, I think, referenced, there's no clearer example of this than looking now at the Biden administration with its National Security Council and its most senior person on the Indo-Pacific in a new position as Indo-Pacific coordinator is Kurt Campbell, who literally is the author of The Pivot, the book, and a key architect of the strategy. So I think that's important to point at the onset. I found it interesting as well, and I often get this question also here in Canada as we're thinking deeply about the Indo-Pacific framing. And if you look at speeches from senior US officials, so I think it was referenced at least in one of the prior remarks about Hillary Clinton's Asia-Pacific Century piece and foreign policy. And if you look at some of the wording that she used versus fast forwarding to the Trump administration, for example. And I know not many people even remember Rex Tillerson, but he was a Secretary of State at one point. And one of his first key policy speeches on this region was at CSIS, a think tank in DC. And I looked at his speech focused on India, and he referenced the Indo-Pacific 24 times. And now, if we look at policy speeches by U.S. officials, it's no surprise to see Indo-Pacific probably more times than that. But at that time, it was quite significant to see that. And if you look at Hillary Clinton's article on the Pacific Century, you don't see it once. But I think the larger point is, as I referenced at the beginning, the nuts and bolts of the way that the U.S. has engaged in this region fundamentally hasn't changed that much. I want to move on from that point to talk a little bit precisely about Japan and Korea, which Japan is an area that I normally in non-COVID days spend a good time of my life with one of my institutional homes at the Japanese Institute of International Affairs. And I also have had the chance to spend quite a bit of time working on U.S. Japan-Korea issues. And one of the banes of my existence, I guess, is having to be involved sometimes in Japan-Korea issues, which is also an area of great tension. But I think all of this is very important, and I think it's important to look at these two key U.S. allies together, because many of their concerns are shared. Of course, they have differences and different viewpoints of the pivot and also current U.S. strategy in the region, but I think they also have some shared issues as well. So let's, first of all, I wanted to start with a bit of an anecdote. And we discussed a bit about unending wars in the Middle East. And I think this was the legacy going into the Obama administration. And I think this was part of the framework about the language of the pivot. I think as Rachel had noted, there wasn't necessarily an aggressive pivot per se, because I think the Bush administration and previous administrations were also engaged in this region. But I think there was a feeling in the White House that there was a need to reshape the narrative. And I think that especially this was informed by some of the long conflicts in the Middle East. And I think largely that was welcomed in Tokyo and Seoul, the idea of reframing this narrative away from the Middle East and more towards the Asia Pacific. Although one interesting thing that, and somewhat ironic, I remember being at a conference in 2013 in the early years of the Obama administration. And this was when the conflict in Syria was happening. And I think all of us famously remember the red line that was crossed, and there was no punishment for that on Syria's use of chemical weapons. And, during this sort of Track 1.5 conference, it was a US, Japan, South Korea conference. The chair of the conference, who was an American, he asked, what do you think the Obama administration should do? Should it perform a strike against Syria because of this action? And on one side, you would think, well, the Japanese and Koreans, the last thing they want is the Americans involved in another conflict in the Middle East, and again, turning their attention away from the Indo-Pacific. But interesting, the show of hands was almost unanimous that both sides said, well, yes, we do want the US to strike. And I think the rationale for that and the reasoning was that if the US president stands up and declares red lines, whether this is an alliance red line or not, we know those are different, but still that has implications for deterrence, that has implications for credibility. So that was an interesting sort of moment for me to see how the perceptions of the Obama administration, how that might affect allies such as Japan and Korea and their own sort of feelings and insecurities about how the US may or may not support them in contingencies. To get specific on Japan, I think generally through the Obama administration, it wasn't a perfect relationship. I think in larger terms, I think that there were and have been concerns about Obama's policy towards China, the level of gravity that he took that relationship, whether he potentially was too focused on the cooperation angle and not as razor focused on some of the emerging security concerns, especially in the South China Sea. But I will say, before kind of touching on that generally, especially leadership is very important in determining the trajectory of these relationships. And one of the things that Japan had in its court, you can't take this for granted in Japan in the political system, is that they actually had leadership stability. Prime Minister Abe, who recently stepped down because of health issues, had been prime minister for a long time and actually became the longest serving modern day Japanese prime minister. And he struck up a pretty good relationship with President Obama. And I think the sort of the fruition of that relationship in many senses came when Obama made his speech in Hiroshima, which I think was very well received by Prime Minister Abe and the Japanese public writ large. So despite some of the policy issues, I think this leadership element ended up kind of managing that alliance in a pretty good stead. But on particular sensitive alliance issues during this period, during the pivot, rebalance, first and foremost for the Japanese was the Senkaku Islands issue in the East China Sea, in particular from 2011 to 2016. But what I will, constantly refer people to is that this is not a latent issue. This is anyone who's just seen the recent changes in China's legislation regarding Coast Guard and the use of armed force would understand that this is an everyday concern for the Japanese and for the US-Japan alliance. But at that time in 2011 to 2016, this was a very significant national security concern for the Japanese, and very much were looking for the US as their key ally to provide as much support and deterrence and public statements as they could. And on this regard, I think that the U.S. did a relatively good job, and you're seeing consistent statements from all levels. President Obama down to Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary level, of U.S. Commitment to the administration, the Japanese administration of these islands, which were covered under Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. So I think that has been welcome, and we've seen that throughout the Trump administration and now through the Biden administration. One of the first sort of bilateral meetings with Secretary of State Blinken and his counterpart, the United States reiterated its support for including these islands under Article 5. So I think all of that has been very welcome. And interesting enough, for those who are focused on the East China Sea dispute and some of the complexities there, the spokesman at the Pentagon recently made, I don't know if it was an error, but he recently referenced support for Japanese sovereignty over the Senkaku, and that has really, made some of my Japanese colleagues quite a buzz. Whether this is a change in policy, that the Pentagon has walked that back a little bit, but that is very, very significant if that's the case. And I can imagine our South Korean friends will be calling the National Security Council quite quickly and asking what's the status on Takeshima Dokdo as well, which is a dispute between the two allies. So generally, I think those things were welcomed by the Japanese side. There were some concerns, and I think when thinking about the pivot, often I think we think about it. Some of the reflections have been security centric. I think Rachel referenced the basing deal with the Philippines, with the Australians as well. For some of the freedom of navigation operations, et cetera. But I think we often tend to forget, or maybe we want to forget, that one of the main pillars, and I think this is what one of the allies thought, especially Japan, was the sort of economic leg. And this really was the TPP. I think Obama's framing of the TPP in strategic terms and in many senses in national security terms helped push the Japanese side over the edge into joining that deal. And I think that's another point that's sort of forgotten into the dustbin of history, is that Japan's inclusion was a given, which it absolutely was not. This was a very difficult trade deal for the Japanese politically to be involved in, with their agricultural lobbies and other factors which are closely tied to the ruling Conservative Party. So this was a very hard sell for the Abe administration to get into, but I think they saw the broader national security implications of doing this, especially with US leadership. So the US failure, obviously, to follow through with the TPP was one of the largest sort of disappointments, I would say, of the pivot from a Japanese perspective. Another thing, I would like to shift a little bit to Korea, and I don't necessarily see these things as completely isolated, because as I said, there are shared elements to this. And one of those that I'll reference is US-Japan, South Korea cooperation, and a lot of that has been focused obviously on DPRK. So part of these discussions, and again, I referenced the Syria anecdote, and I have been involved in a lot of these trilaterals with US, Japan, and Korea over the years. And I think one of the issues that has always been a challenge is, where's the focus? And I think especially post-2011, post-2010, the Japanese side, it was quite clear where the focus was, I think, and also quite clear where the focus remains. And I think that's on China. It's not to say that they're not concerned about missiles and the nuclear weapons program from North Korea, but I think their primary short, medium, long-term geostrategic concern is the rise of China. South Korea, I think, also has had its ups and downs with China. We saw this with the THAAD incident, the anti-missile defense battery, and the actions that the Chinese side took. So by no means is South Korea naive to the challenges from China, but I think that they have a different perspective. I think their geography dictates that, but also their, more important, their national security situation with North Korea and the realization that China holds a lot of the strings to that situation. So that always has been a source of tensions in the way that that trilateral relationship has operated. Throw on top of that, I think the historical tensions between Japan and South Korea and the US's role in trying to manage that. And it's really proved quite challenging. I think those who remember President Obama trying to essentially forcibly getting together Prime Minister Abe and and President Park at the time at the Nuclear Security Summit in The Hague. I mean, this was no easy endeavor, and it continues. This continues to be a long standing sort of important but tense area of US foreign policy, is trying to get its two key East Asian allies to work together. So I think that the South Korean side, there was tensions in many sense in constantly hearing from the US that, well, you need to work with Japan for security reasons. I think they understood that it was in their own national interests to do that. But of course, politically, it became increasingly difficult. And we've seen this, at the time with the original formulation of GSAMIA, which is a military intelligence sharing agreement, which finally was completed, but is constantly under pressure as well because of the historical issues. The second thing, and I do want to quickly shift before I end, because I realize my time is getting tight, to the current day, and how some of these issues that I've talked about are being thought about now, and the current articulation of pivot rebalance, which is now the free and open Indo-Pacific, how that's being viewed by both South Korea and Japan. I would say that generally there's a lot of positivity, especially from the Japanese side. I think, the US have effectively plagiarized large parts of the sort of a forced plagiarization, I would say, or a happy plagiarization from the Japanese side. I think they were happy that the US adopted much of their wording of the free and open Indo-Pacific. But I would agree with Rachel that it's not a perfectly congruent copy. There are certain elements, I think, of nuance and pragmatism that are built into the Japanese strategy that are not identical in the US approach, especially that one from the previous administration. All that being said, though, the large trend line of the US being much more open-eyed on China, much more focused on elements of competition, as long as there's pragmatism built into that, I think is very welcome from the Japanese side. I think one of their chief concerns during the pivot rebalance years was there wasn't quite that focus. I think there was more of a focus on the cooperative side, and also the distraction in many sense of DPRK that sort of took the eyes away from China. So I think generally the trend line of being much more focused on China is important. I think the downside of this, and this is something that I'm hoping we'll see a different side, and I expect we will see a different side with this current administration in Washington, is on the treatment of allies. Obviously, the Biden administration has premised this as a big part of its foreign policy. The US and Japan have now reached a deal for a one-year deal anyways for their burden sharing host nation support, which is a positive development. I think this was a nightmare in Tokyo, thinking about how this might go, especially if there was a second Trump administration. They saw what South Korea had to go through as well through burden sharing negotiations. So I think that is a page to watch, frankly. I think things will get better, but we shouldn't assume that's a guarantee. These are longstanding issues for any alliance, and we're not completely going to turn the page on burden sharing. But this is something that I feel the Japanese feel in a bit of a better situation right now than potentially they felt in October or September of last year. The last thing I'll note is I think on trade and just the broader strategic formulation of this. So maybe South Korea will decide to join the CPTPP. That could be a positive element. They already have, of course, bilateral trade agreement with the US. But I think that the broader strategic engagement of FOIP or an Indo-Pacific strategy and how Japan and Korea might fit in with the US approach, I see Japan as a much more natural fit, just because, as I said, largely this was a Japanese strategy. A lot of the intellectual origins of FOIP and the Indo-Pacific concept come from Japan. With South Korea, I think there's some challenges. I think largely they recognize many of the challenges that the US identifies in its FOIP vis-a-vis China, South Korea, or North Korea, et cetera. But two fundamental challenges. One is, as I referenced earlier, they have to live in the world with China. They are in the armpit of the belly of the beast, so to say, and China's their number one trading partner. So I think there's a natural friction in how how much they align themselves with FOIP strategy, but be careful on other elements. So we've seen this with discussions on Quad Plus, where the South Korean side has seen a bit more hesitant. The second thing I'll close on too is, I think, which is pushing the South Koreans or making them a bit more risk averse on the free and open Indo-Pacific, frankly, is the fact that it's a Japanese strategy. Even though the United States has their own approach, and I think the South Koreans have endorsed the US approach, they're well aware that the Japanese are very involved in FOIP, and in many ways the intellectual grandfather of this in the region. So I think that, even if they agree with parts of it, and their southbound strategy for ASEAN and South Asia, I think is very aligned with many parts of the Japanese strategy too. But politically, this is toxic, I think, to try to say that we will do this in tandem with the Japanese at this point, anyways. So I think I'll leave it for now, and very much welcome questions, and excited to hear fellow panelists.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you for bringing this lovely acronym, the FOIP, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, into that story, and particularly emphasizing the fact that there is a lot of continuation, of course, on the American side with the pivot, but there are also relatively sharp contrasts between the US version of FOIP and what the Japanese have been pushing for. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to discuss that further later on. So now turning to our third panelist, Natalie Samby. Natalie is a scholar at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University. She is a specialist of Indonesian military history, a research fellow at the Perth US Asia Center, and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she works on Indonesian foreign and defense policy, as well as Southeast Asian security. She is the founder and executive director of Verve Research, which is an independent research group that works on the relationships between militaries and societies in Southeast Asia. Natalie, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen for everybody. Now I hope everybody can see that.
We can.
Yes? Okay, voila. Okay, I just want to say thank you so much to the Network of Strategic Analysis. Merci beaucoup surtout à Jonathan de m'avoir invité.
In particular, thank you to Jonathan for inviting me to be here. I'm delighted to be with you to present on a topic that I'm just passionate about.
Verve. My group, as Stephanie said, we focus on the relationships between militaries and societies in Southeast Asia. I'll quickly just give a breakdown of my talk. In response to the US's pivot and the Indo-Pacific policies, I'll give the Australian reaction, I'll follow up with Indonesia, and then I'll discuss what this means for Canada. All right, first and foremost, just to give a glance at Australia, we're 25 million people, a relatively high standard of living, with about $55,000 GDP per capita, and we're currently led by a conservative government re-elected for another 3-year term. Generally speaking, Australia has been quite receptive of the pivot. It's been very favorable. And the reason for that is, for a bit of context, is that Australia has been a close ally of the United States since 1952. That, and being an island continent, has formed the bedrock of Australia's strategic culture, and support for ANZUS has received has been bipartisan pretty much since the beginning. To give a bit of context for how close Australia feels to that pivot strategy, Obama made a major pivot-related announcement from Darwin, which is our northernmost state capital, and it talked about the marine rotation from there. And since that time, Australia has been receptive insofar as that it's incorporated pivot-related rhetoric into a lot of its official documentation, whether that be foreign policy white papers or defense policy white papers as well. And there again, you can see the optics of that, of Prime Minister Julia Gillard at the time cheering on President Obama, which I think is an adequate snapshot of how Australia feels towards US policy in the region. But to balance that out, I'd want to emphasize that Australia has its own journey with the idea of its Indo-Pacific identity, I want to underscore the fact that since 2013, Australia has been using the term Indo-Pacific in many of its major policy documents. A lot of that has involved outlining the area as a secure, open, and prosperous place, has been ASEAN-centric as well. And as I said earlier, as an island continent, this is a very natural outlook for a country positioned between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. And just to give an indication of that, this is an important map which has been adopted in many of our policy documents, again, showing how critical it is that the Indian and Pacific Ocean areas are integrated into one strategic concept for Australia, especially since we are highly dependent on maritime trade. Okay. But moving on from that, there were serious concerns during the Trump era. As Jonathan outlined earlier, a lot of pressure during that administration's time on allies meant that Australia's strategy at the time was to keep our head down and to diversify our ties with non-US allies. And as Rachel outlined, the change of leadership within China around that time led to a deterioration not only between Chinese ties and other regional ties, but particularly with Australia as well. With a region that was undergoing change at the moment with increasing illiberalism, Australia sought to diversify ties with a lot of strategic partnerships, elevating its relationship with Japan in 2014, with Vietnam in 2018, and pledging to hold more regular ministerial and governmental ties with ASEAN, as well as being an enthusiastic participant in the relaunch of the Quad since 2017. The other thing Australia has done is invite and support the involvement of other major players within the Indo-Pacific. That includes the United Kingdom, but also France. Australia is the member of a number of minilateral initiatives, and one such initiative is a trilateral between India, France, and Australia at the senior officials level as well. So there is just a photo of the Quad Admirals at one of the early Racina Dialogue a few years ago. Should also mention that Australia is now a member of the Malabar exercise, which includes the Quad navies as well. So despite those early concerns about what would have been, what might have been pressure or perhaps US withdrawal from the Pacific, ties between the United States and Australia remained relatively strong. Australia's attitude has been relatively positive towards the free and open Indo-Pacific. It's adopted some of the language in terms of maintaining the character of the liberal order. And as one of my colleagues, Andrew Phillips, has said, Australians like American hegemony and have been sorry to sort of see it fade. But a lot of this sense of reassurance about the US sticking around in the region has also been fueled a lot about domestic concerns with China. And perhaps we can get back into that into the question and answer time. And as I said, that those meetings, the bilateral relationship is underpinned by a continuation of a lot of bilateral activities, one of which has been OSMIN, which was held in person last year as well, despite the pandemic. So just to give an idea, again, in our foreign policy white papers, we've released statements that suggest ongoing support for US global leadership. At the time when this was released, I think that statement was actually much more hopeful than it is. I think, as I'll say later, there'll be a lot of relief amongst think tank and policy circles in Canberra that the Biden administration will commence. And so we'll see how that goes. But so today, where we find Australia in relative to the Indo-Pacific and the pivot's legacies, that we're focused on post-COVID economic recovery in our immediate region. We're looking to stability and increased Indo-Pacific engagement under the Biden administration, and hopefully less provocation of China. As a result of the pivot, one of the major legacies has been exercising regularly with Marines since 2012, which has helped boost our interoperability between our armed forces. But really, China continues to be a major factor in the way in which Australia has approached, particularly security and trade in the Indo-Pacific, given China's increased agitation in the South China Sea and perceptions of domestic interference, particularly in terms of critical infrastructure in Australia. I'll skip this slide just because this is about domestic political interference in China. We'll get back into this perhaps in the question and answer time. What I really would like to come to is talking a little bit about Indonesia as representative of the ways in which Southeast Asia has responded to the pivot strategy. Now, as the largest country in Southeast Asia, I think Indonesia's viewpoint is worth some elaboration. So just at a glance, in comparison to Australia, Indonesia has more than 10 times the population, spread across an archipelago of about 17,000 islands, and the GDP is less than 10% of Australia. So just to give a disparity in how in each country, at least in its domestic circumstances, is dealing with foreign policy matters. And just to give you an indication, there's Indonesia located to the north of Australia, similar to Australia between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, that those trade routes around that strategic construct are also critical for Indonesia. So Indonesia's initial reaction to the pivot was probably characterized by a sense of hesitation. And to give a bit of background, Indonesia has been a strategically non-aligned country since 1945, save for a brief period of de facto Western alignment during the Suharto era. Being an archipelago, a lot of its strategic and military culture is shaped not only by this strategic autonomy, but also by archipelagic vulnerability as well. And as such, it has developed this idea of a free and active foreign policy, so no military alliances. At the time that the pivot was announced, President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono was leading the country. He was a retired military general at the time, and he presided over an era where there was much domestic stability, a growth rate of 6% per annum of GDP, and therefore during his second term, he could afford to focus a lot more on foreign policy and declare that he wanted 1 million friends and 0 enemies. So at the time, you couldn't really find a president that was going to be more predisposed to doing more with the United States, and within the United States that was more interested in the region as well. And at the time, ties with the United States were quite good, despite an arms embargo that had been applied after the end of Indonesia's involvement in Timor-Leste. A defense cooperation was restored in 2005. Having said that, as I said, initial sentiments towards the pivot were not only of hesitation, but of anxiety. If you could imagine that there would be a presence of US Marines in Australia's most northernmost capital, state capital, which is extremely close to Indonesian soil, for historical reasons, that stoked a lot of fear about foreign interference and a bit too close for comfort. So there's Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and to his left, an important gentleman who was the foreign minister at the time, Mani Natalegawa. So similar to Australia, Indonesia has had its own journey with an Indo-Pacific identity, and a lot of that was spearheaded by Foreign Minister Natalegawa. In particular, in 2013, he gave a speech at CSIS in Washington. And in this speech, he talked about Indonesia being in the middle or at the heart of a strategic triangle between Japan, India, and Australia. Makes no mention of the US or China, but in his view, it's those countries that really ought to take the lead in the Indo-Pacific at the time. And in particular, he took the initiative to propose an Indo-Pacific treaty in order to be able to show not only Indonesian leadership, but in order to be able to root a lot of Indo-Pacific regional architecture within the principles of ASEAN. Also, Foreign Minister Natalegawa at the time played a key role in ASEAN, being quite activist, and there were parallels at the time with the role he played on diplomatic initiatives around Myanmar with how the current foreign minister is dealing with the post-coup situation. But as I said earlier, not only was there a president that was conducive to receiving the pivot, but there was a foreign minister that was keen to do more. And there were large expectations of the United States at the time for nostalgic reasons, that because Obama had lived in Indonesia as a child. But having said that, there was a lot of hesitation with the fact that as a Southeast Asian country, Indonesia and even Australia looked on with interest and if not concern when the United States did not seem to push back very strongly against China when a treaty ally of its, the Philippines, was in a sort of a confrontation with Chinese vessels over the Scarborough Shoal in 2013. So again, looking at the Indonesian perspective, the idea of the Indo-Pacific continued on into Joko Widodo's presidency, which commenced in 2014. When he was elected as a more grassroots president, he was more internally focused, and he released this concept known as the Global Maritime Fulcrum that has parallels with the Indo-Pacific insofar as it positions Indonesia as a critical state between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans and wanted to boost Indonesia's maritime security, maritime identity, and focus on maritime security as well. But as his presidency lapsed further, he became more interested in the concept of the Indo-Pacific more broadly, and Indonesia released its own definition of the Indo-Pacific that was focused not necessarily on any sense of US leadership, but emphasized multipolarity. And in particular, its wording has the word inclusiveness there, which is not only meant to mean China, but also India as well. India's inclusion in regional architecture has been critical for Indonesia as well. Again, Jokowi has been pushing for ASEAN centrality, ASEAN centricity within conceptions of the Indo-Pacific. And indeed, Indonesia has had some success pushing the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, but that, if according to Malaysia's foreign minister, was more of a deal out of pragmatism and was a much more watered down version of what Indonesia had actually pushed for in the first place. So as I said, the relationship between India and Indonesia has been stepping up, and that has been seen not only by Australia, but other regional states as an important pillar of where the Indo-Pacific is headed. Again, just to underscore how Indonesia sees itself within this construct, it sees itself as an important leader, a prominent player in the creation of regional architecture. And so what this means in practice, not just philosophically, is that Indonesia approaches the Indo-Pacific through major fora, the East Asia Summit and Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is much to Australia's pleasure. And again, leading with ASEAN related mechanisms. It's Our Eyes Initiative, which is an intelligence gathering between 5 or 6 Southeast Asian states. And what Indonesia moves away from rather than to is a sense of either US Pax Sinico or Pax Americana in the Indo-Pacific. It sees US or China themselves as belligerent superpowers, but yet it has to keep close ties with both, particularly because Jokowi has been keen to develop infrastructure across the archipelago. So there's quite a complicated relationship there, but in sum, Indonesia prefers to see multipolarity within the region. Moving forward in terms of Indonesia's view of FOIP and the Quad, again, because of its ambivalence to its US hegemony and its own efforts at conceptualizing the free and open Indo-Pacific, it's been generally ambivalent towards that, particularly because it is concerned about being provocative towards China. Similarly, because of that strategic non-alignment and its desire to balance ties with both the United States and with China, it shies away from really stunning endorsements of the Quad, unlike Australia. It is really concerned about anything that has or smacks of the perception of Chinese containment. And also there's a degree of skepticism about the optics of having the 4 Quad admirals, for instance, when really Indonesia is quite concerned about the limits of gray zone activities within the South China Sea, the use of the Coast Guard, for instance, as opposed to the Navy. So as I said earlier, the reality is that Indonesia, like many states in the region, requires continued stable ties with China. China has been an extremely important partner, delivering critical PPE and also the first tranche of Indonesia's vaccinations against the coronavirus, Sinovac. But Indonesia at the same time is wary about China's incursions into its EEZ around the Natuna Islands, because as you can see from this map, there is a purported overlap between China's 9-line claim and the EEZ around the Natuna Islands. So again, that is a critical balancing act, and any needless provocation with Indonesia overtly supporting constructs like the Quad is something that it avoids. So where does this leave us Indonesia today? So as you can see, President Jokowi there in the time of Corona, is that despite its activism and its desire to play a role in the construction of Indo-Pacific regional architecture, Indonesia continues to be domestically focused. That's not just due to its history of having to deal with terrorism, separatism, and armed rebellion, but in the added pressure that has now come from COVID-19. Indonesia is also undergoing what some scholars have called increasing liberalism. If you look at Freedom House's index, you can see that its rating under Jokowi has dropped as Indonesia starts to tighten up, for instance, freedom of the internet, and has been seen to securitize health policies as well. But as I said earlier, because it's an archipelago, a lot of its thinking is about securing its sovereignty and its territoriality in a domestic sense. And indeed, there might be even more pressure now, even though its military is modernizing and there are defense budget increases, there's still a long way to go for Indonesia in terms of its naval and its Air Force defenses. So what does this all mean for Canada? One of the things I wanted to emphasize in my remarks today is that the Indo-Pacific for Australia and Indonesia has really moved beyond Washington-centric narratives. Of course, the United States remains an important partner for Australia, but conceptualizing of the Indo-Pacific started along before FOIP and to some degree together with the pivot, but independent of the pivot. That's in terms of the philosophical outlook for the Indo-Pacific in Canberra and Jakarta. But in terms of approach, One of the things to avoid, I think, and I can talk about this in the Q&A, is megaphone diplomacy. That while it is important to underscore certain values, like the liberal character of the order, and this can be uncomfortable in certain capitals of Southeast Asia, which might be considered less than liberal. So emphasizing a values-based diplomacy might work in some contexts, but making that an overarching feature of an approach might be problematic in certain contexts. But certainly in terms of players, anything that's ASEAN-led is favorable. Anything which is an issue-based minilateral, like I said, the flourishing of trilaterals and quadrilaterals that don't necessarily include the United States or something that Australia is really getting to, even Indonesia. A new trilateral that's formed between foreign ministers is Australia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste. Like I said, another one with France, or something like the Bali Democracy Forum, or even IORA. I know the Indian Ocean is not contiguous with Canada. It might be an area where maritime security, there might be an observer status through which there might be more substantial contributions made. And in terms of issues, I was at a workshop on Monday focused on ASEAN, and the emphasis there was that sustainable economic recovery is really their priority after COVID. And that looks like capacity building and connectivity, not only for Indonesia across the archipelago, but between ASEAN states, particularly helping Southeast Asia and Australia's role within that, building up its infrastructure and also internet environment standards, maritime security, as I said earlier, and what I think might be a critical role for Canada to continue playing and supporting our climate change initiatives, building up climate change resiliency, particularly given Indonesia and now Australia's vulnerability to natural disasters that are climate change linked. So I'd like to just finish with one last thought. Given that Australia and Indonesia have slightly different thinking about the Indo-Pacific, I quite like this quote from Muhammad Hatta, who was one of Indonesia's founding leaders, that the current foreign minister quoted in her annual address in January. And he says, "We must not become the object of an international conflict. On the contrary, we must remain the subject who reserves the right to decide our own destiny." And so in my thinking, for us in the Indo-Pacific, for Australia, for Indonesia, and for Canada, it would be good not to be dictated to. As subjects, we reserve the right to decide our own Indo-Pacific destiny, and we can do so together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. You had a pretty tall order here, having to discuss Australia and Southeast Asian perspectives. And I think obviously your choice of focusing on Indonesia is very appreciated. I really want to thank you for your generosity in bringing the Canadian angle into the story. I think coming from someone based in Australia, usually there is a tendency to see Canada as being kind of in a limited competition, with Australia, and trying to find a space for engagement in the region. And obviously Australia would be totally right not to think about us all that much, but still, so these generous suggestions are definitely appreciated. And hopefully we can return to the Canadian angle a little bit later, as I would love to hear from the other panelists as well on lessons learned that could inform how Canada approaches the region. But then we still have a fourth panelist, and last but not least is Cléo Pascal. Cléo Pascal is an associate fellow at Chatham House, where she currently leads a project on perceptions of strategic shifts in the Indo-Pacific, with a focus on a number of countries: India, the US, Japan, Oceania, the UK, and France. She is a visiting fellow at the Centre d'études et de recherche internationale de l'Université de Montréal, and she is a non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in DC. Cléo, when you're ready.
Hi, last and definitely least, considering the three previous presentations. Et il faut dire que ça me fait grand plaisir d'être ici parmi vous. Je suis en Florida.
I must say that I'm delighted to be with you. I'm in Florida for work, might I add. And generally in February in Florida, you hear a lot of French around the corner. Unfortunately, it's not the case today. So I am delighted, as I said, to be here and to have this opportunity to be with you. I'll try and share my screen.
See if we can do it. Here we go. Fingers crossed.
All good.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Because I can't.
That's we have a YouTube video. Is that
yeah? I
what you're going for?
think you've shared perhaps the wrong screen, Claire.
Probably. I've shared the ABC thing.
Yeah.
Let me try that.
It would be your other window.
Okay. Trying this. Share. No, still not doing it.
Okay, I'll do this for you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I do not know why this isn't working. Okay, great. So I'm going to explain a little bit what I've been doing for the past year and a half. The previous presentations were excellent for giving very large geographic and time point of view overviews. What I've been doing, this project that we've been doing, has been focusing very much on the last 2 years, because there's been a lot of changes in the last 2 years, about perceptions in the region, how countries are viewing each other. So next slide. Okay, so the project was, we took a series of countries, because as more countries are piling into this Indo-Pacific space, the problem is that sometimes they don't fully understand what other countries involved are already thinking, what their perceptions are of the region and of themselves. And the result is that they might be coming in, as sort of as Natalie said, and it'll come up later, you know, they might think, okay, we'll talk about rules-based orders or values, but the people in the region don't perceive that in the way necessarily that you think they do. And so in order to have a kind of more cohesive working together within the Indo-Pacific, it's very important to understand the perceptions of others. You may decide not to dovetail with their perceptions and work with them and to do something different, but at least understanding them means that there are going to be fewer mistakes along the way, especially strategic surprises. Next slide. So what we did was there were 7 countries involved. We had partner think tanks in each of the different locations. UK, obviously, we did it at Chatham House. We had l'Institut Français de Relations Internationales in Paris. In DC, it was the East West Center. In India, it was Gateway House. In Tonga, there's a lot of talk about Oceania, about the Pacific Islands, but normally that it passes through Australia and New Zealand. In our case, what we did was we partnered with a think tank in Tonga to find out what they were thinking. In Japan, we did a lot of one-on-one discussions because roundtables work a little bit less well. Culturally, people are a little bit more shy to put forward their points of view. And the same thing in Beijing and Shanghai, there are a lot of one-on-one interviews. These roundtables were supplemented by high-level in-person one-on-one interviews, all under the Chatham House rule, of course. So in all, we talked to a couple hundred Indo-Pacific policymakers and experts in those countries, in those 7 countries. And it was between September 2019 and it ended, I flew out of Tokyo March 8, 2020, right before everything completely shut down. So it's a snapshot of what the world looked like before COVID. Next slide. So I'm going to focus, obviously, because my remit was Europe. So I'm going to focus on France and the UK and what they think of themselves in the Indo-Pacific and what they think of others in the Indo-Pacific. And it's worth sort of just giving a bit of background to that. So the reasons we picked France and the UK was they're the largest maritime EU powers in the Indo-Pacific. They both have history and still some territories. In the case of France, a lot of territories in the Indo-Pacific. They have more diplomatic representation in the EU. They have missions, but there's also the networks of the Commonwealth and La Francophonie. They're both P5 members, obviously. They're both nuclear powers, but they also don't necessarily always get along. So it's been interesting watching the evolution side by side. Next slide. So the way that we did this research was we did, first of all, an overview in these roundtables of the state of existing play. And then we asked them each what they thought of their relationships with each of the other countries over the next 4 years. So in the case of France, for example, what do you think the French-US relationship will be like over the next 5 years, the French-UK relationship in the context of the Indo-Pacific? Because as you can see from this photo, which is from the coronation of the King of Tonga in 2015, the French might think they're presenting a certain perception of themselves in the region, and the Tongans might think that they're looking at something totally different. We talked about potential positive and negative inflection points. So in the case of the France-UK relationship, what could make it go much better? What could make it go much worse? So that, you know, we could tease out some of those variations. Next slide. So the macro findings of the report isn't out yet. It'll be out within the next few weeks. So the macro BC, before COVID findings, cut across all the countries. And these are some of the themes that have come up in the previous presentations. What we found was in pretty much all of the countries, and again, this is before COVID, there were very serious domestic divisions regarding China. You know, Indo-Pacific construct is about China. I mean, it just is. So that we didn't explicitly ask the countries about their relationship to China, but it was implicit in all of the discussions and in how they were going to relate to all of their allies. So what came out was there were a lot of domestic divisions regarding China, and the divisions tended to, in almost every country, follow along the political and economic communities, which favored more engagement with China along economic lines. And the economic engagement would feed into the political engagement through campaign financing and all the usual stuff. Meanwhile, the defense, strategic, and intelligence communities were much, much more cautious about China. So there is that division. So you consistently get one side telling you one thing and another side telling you another. The second was there was a lot of uncertainty about major global trends and what direction they would be going in. So Brexit, US elections, at that point, Abe was still in power, whether Abe would stay in power. So that strategic foresight uncertainty was also very much in the room. Somebody in the US said that they had more balls in the air at this time than at any time since World War II. And the result of that domestic division and the uncertainty was a lot of hedging. So in most countries, that was what we found across the board. So now we're gonna talk specifically about the two countries that we looked at from Europe. Next slide, please. So just to give a bit of an idea of France, France considers itself, and it is, legitimately a resident power in the Indo-Pacific. This is quite a well-known slide from one of their policy documents. They have large territories in the region, they have citizens in the region, they have military assets in the region, and they're becoming increasingly active for a wide range of reasons. Next slide. Okay, this is a long slide. I'll go through it one by one, but this basically gives you some background to it. And if anybody wants the presentation, they're welcome to have it. And the report will be out soon. So it's a legitimately resident power. There is a very strong maritime dimension to France's Indo-Pacific strategy. These again, were the outcomes of the roundtable discussions. I'm telling you sort of what the French said about themselves. In 2019, they put out a defense strategy and a foreign policy strategy specifically focused on the Indo-Pacific. In France, the political and economic and defense, strategic, and intelligence communities were much more closely aligned on the Indo-Pacific than in many other countries. That's a byproduct of the structure of the French state economy. There was particularly emphasis on diversified and deep economic engagement in the region, especially around defense, energy, and infrastructure. Those were the three priorities. One of the goals, they said, was to attain the status of a local actor, which would allow it to contribute to shaping norms. They didn't want to be seen as a European power in the region, but as somebody who lives in the region. French go into negotiations and try to distinguish itself by saying any type of agreement with France has a lower political and military conditionality than that of the United States. It's the French value added. They were very focused on targeted bilaterals. So the French-India relationship has been going on since the 50s. It's quite deep. The Indians value it quite a lot, especially around space cooperation, but a lot around maritime domain awareness in the Indian Ocean, things like that. They were clear to say that the policy was still in formation and it lacked administrative, financial, and human resources to fully translate demands into operations, saying that it's not because there's a strategy on the Indo-Pacific that France is present everywhere. There were a lot of government officials in this discussion, and they were a little bit frustrated by that, by the bureaucracy. And one way that they were dealing with that was to create a division of labor with the partners. So in Oceania, France might work with Australia in one location and in Japan in a different location to try to use their perceived limited resources more effectively. They were concerned that if there was increasing polarization between US and China, their maneuvering room would be decreased. They wouldn't be able to hedge as much, and that for them was an economic problem. But their ultimate goal was de ne pas se faire bouffer. Basically, they wanted to be able to survive in the Indo-Pacific. And in terms of the relationship between the French approach and the EU, they're theoretically is coordinated. We'll get to this later, but there isn't an EU Indo-Pacific policy now, and the French policy is very much of a French policy. Next slide. Thank you. This is the UK equivalent. The UK is much less developed in the Indo-Pacific. So they talked about their value being member of the Five Eyes, the Five Powers Defense Agreements, which is agreements between the UK, Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, and New Zealand. They have some good basing. They put some emphasis on the Commonwealth. The UK opened 3 new high commissions in Oceania. 2018 under Boris Johnson, it was announced. So that's a consistent policy. Everybody's waiting for the release of the integrated review, which will be the UK government's biggest review of foreign defense and development policy since the Cold War. That's due within the next few weeks. The rumors are that there's a lot on the Indo-Pacific there, and that Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, is defining the Indo-Pacific as being east of India. Unlike France, in the UK, the political economic side and the defense, strategic and intelligence side were very divided, completely different approaches. The political and economic side was talking about we should start thinking of ourselves as a middle power. What do middle powers do? Conflict, peacekeeping, diplomacy, talking about finding the right niches. Whereas on the defense, strategic, and intel side, they thought that the FCO language, it's changed names, but at the time it was FCO language, was not helpful at all. And terms like rule-based order irritate some Indo-Pacific partners. They find it old-fashioned and they don't recognize it. So they thought that it would be better to put the priority on defense and strategic ties. For example, the UK-Japan joint statement of 2019 on global strategic partnership. Next slide, please. Thanks. So now it kind of gets into the interesting thing where they start looking at each other. So what did France think of the UK? So the French thought the UK has limited military presence in the Indo-Pacific, and what it had were largely empty shells. The French defense industries succeeded in acquiring important positions in former British zones of influence. They were very happy with that. French and British policies are not always aligned. post-Brexit positioning of global Britain was not backed up by the UK budget. That's currently, and possibly not good for France as it could evoke colonial memories. They questioned whether the UK would take the plunge and pursue a comprehensive strategy in the Indo-Pacific. The positive ways forward, they thought, was maybe getting French access to some of the UK bases and doing some joint training and operations with France. On the UK side, the French, the UK had a level of admiration for France's Indo-Pacific efforts and thought it was something the UK should emulate. And they thought about maybe working with France on capacity building in the Indo-Pacific, for example, on the UN Convention on the Law at Sea or strategic threat analyses, because if they did that, they would also get a better idea of what France saw as a threat in the region. Next slide, please. Very quick summary of some of the other views. On both sides, the UK-India relationship was not great. On the French and India side, it was quite strong, surprisingly strong. On the Japan and UK relationship on both sides, it was quite strong and evolving, and I think both sides wanted more. Next slide, please. We're not really talking about China, but I think it's worth bringing out three things that we found from the Chinese perceptions. And this was, again, interviews that were done in China by a Chinese researcher. All of the Chinese think tank and policy people that were interviewed, all of them thought that there was going to be a kinetic conflict in the Indo-Pacific by 2024. They disagreed on the scale, whether it would be something big or some smaller stuff. And remember, this is before COVID. The second was that they all said, again, that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea no longer reflects the reality of current international maritime regime. And the ones with a military background thought that UNCLOS would no longer be valid by 2024. And the foreign policy people thought it probably would, but would have to be moderated. The third thing they said was that they would get much more involved in HADR with smaller states in the Indo-Pacific, and that they knew that it would raise eyebrows in Australia and New Zealand. They would probably also get involved in fighting terrorism and piracy, partially due to economic reasons, but they said partially due to the necessity of putting the Chinese Navy into action mode. Next slide, please. So all of that was before COVID. So then we got COVID. Next slide, please. And then we got China not ramping down its aggression in the region. Next slide, please. And we got the conflict we got 20 dead Indian soldiers on the India-Chinese border, which completely changed the Indian strategic outlook in the region. Next slide, please. And so we saw a very quick speeding up of the sort of alliance building that had been talked about before, including Australia and Malabar. Next slide, please. So we updated the findings and re-talked to people and stuff. And so what we found was that as a result of COVID, all that sort of stuff, the domestic divisions were diminishing. Those who were concerned about China got a lot more traction. The uncertainty also receded because Brexit happened, there were all that sort of stuff, but fundamentally, people were less concerned about rocking the economic boat because of COVID, the economic boat was sinking. As a result of that, in many capitals, the hedging lessened, and there was a much stronger willingness to push back on China. And so we started to see much more willingness and interest in putting together more of these alliances, the Quad, the logistics agreements, the BECA, and all that sort of stuff. So the timeline was compressed and accelerated and deepened in a way that was not expected. And it's creating a new strategic environment where you're seeing things like the UK and the U.S. launching a joint carrier strike group just a few weeks ago. So I'm going to stop here, but it's a very interesting time to be looking at the Indo-Pacific, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cleo, and thanks to all the panelists for sticking to the time limits. So we do have 10 minutes for a Q&A session. There have been a couple of questions posted in the Q&A section already, so I'm gonna draw from those. But I'll ask the panelists to be as effective, brief, and concise as they can in answering these questions. So I'm going to start with Natalie. There was quite an interesting question posted in the Q&A feature from Paul Chamberlain, who's a policy advisor to the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy. And so we're gonna jump right in on the Canadian angle over here. And his question is, what can states in the region can do to support the civility of the extant rules-based maritime order, and at the same time, what would be more valuable to these countries who are firmly within the region, coming from states outside the region like Canada? What kind of contribution is expected, or what kind of contribution would be welcome? Is it more a matter of providing rhetorical support, showing the flag, a mix of both, something else? So I'll start with you, Natalie, but I know that perhaps Jonathan and Cleo and perhaps even Rachel will have some quick thoughts on that as well.
I think there are a couple of elements to it. I think we've more or less just given up on the code of conduct. I mean, it's of course, continuing negotiations are an important form of cooperation between ASEAN and China, but as we've seen increasingly with Chinese vessels, their incursions being made, not just their grey hulls, but white hulls, but also their fishermen in ways that are agitating and provocative and anxiety inducing in Southeast Asian countries, show that really the answer isn't just a freedom navigation operations or not nearly just about providing muscle. It's about, how do we deal with gray zone activities? And in that regard, yes, exercises between navies are important, providing capability and support to navies are important, but certainly boosting cooperation between coast guards, between civilian maritime authorities, not just in bilateral arrangements, but as I said earlier, mini or multilateral arrangements. So I think that's something for countries within the region to think more about, but certainly for countries outside the region like Canada, boosting, for Indonesia, wanting to modernize its military force, looking for ways to support that, but not just in hardware, but in terms of, support, I would say civilian defense capacity. And I can unpack that a bit later, but I'm going to leave some space for Jonathan and Cleo. But yeah, I think that would be the case for now.
Thanks, Natalie. Jonathan, any further thoughts?
I'll try to be very quick, but yeah, I would agree with almost everything Natalie said. And I think the one point I often make too is, the Royal Canadian Navy, I think, is doing some excellent things, and I think we'll be hearing that a little bit in the keynote over lunch. But we need not focus everything on the excellent achievements that they've been doing in the region. I think some of that is very necessary, and it'd be great to see more. I think there's been the Chukudmi class submarine deployment has been welcome. Some of the port visits, I think capacity building, HADR, all of these are great ideas. But one thing to complement that is not to forget the importance of defense diplomacy. I think that complementing the tactical things that we can do in addition to the narrative is very important. And I think that sort of encapsulates why Canada very much needs a strategic approach to this region that can kind of combine the nuts and bolts of what we're doing with the message of why we're doing it and why the region should care about us being there. So I think that would be my quick answer.
I'm going to turn to Cleo and kind of expand the question a little bit, because you provided a very good overview of a bunch of different countries and how they approach developments in the Indo-Pacific. And so I was wondering, based on the findings of your study, what are some of the lessons learned or mistakes to avoid when it comes to a Canadian perspective or a Canadian engagement in the region? Natalie had a chance to chime in on that, but I wanted to ask you as well, based on the findings of your study, what could that be? What could be the interesting implications for how Canada approaches things moving forward?
So, okay, it depends on your goal, obviously, and it depends on whether you think that we're in a Cold War with China. I mean, to be extremely blunt, whether you think that this is it. You know, we have a potentially existential threat economically, which then bleeds in strategically, and which has very serious criminal components. Canada is suffering a lot from Chinese organized crime that's maybe not backed by the state, but not stopped by the state. So if you think that it is that we're in a situation that is quite critical, and you take a look at China's approach, so if you look at the Chinese Communist Party's comprehensive national power construct, which is the defining construct for how they look at engaging in the world, the goal is, the overt think tank community in China's goal is to have China being the #1 country in the world in terms of comprehensive national power. Comprehensive national power includes military, but it's also resources, economic, FDI, intellectual properties across the board. So if we are defending against only one element of that, it's not really to make a big difference, because there are all those other elements that are going to come into play. So it's great to have the Navy there, but if we're still allowing investments on our stock market into Chinese military companies, then that undermines it. So if we really want to start to have an effect, if we think that this is an issue, then we need to go against all of the elements of Chinese comprehensive national power that are undermining us and all of our allies. And the biggest element is economic. So we need to take a look at investments in FDI and how the stock markets work, and start publishing articles about all that Chinese dirty money sitting in Canada and who it belongs to in China, so that the Chinese people have an idea of what their leadership is up to. So it needs to be a much more comprehensive approach if we're serious about it. Otherwise, we can put the ships up and down the South China Sea until electronic warfare and cyber warfare knocks us out, and they can do what they want with Taiwan, or they go into India to divert it and then go up to the Senkakus. But it's such a comprehensive push out that if you're concerned about that, then the pushback needs to be quite comprehensive as well.
I want to leave it to Rachel, perhaps, to chime in here, perhaps respond to what some of the comments that Cleo made. But there was also a specific question from an audience member that I would like to ask to you, Rachel, in particular, although it wasn't directed at any panelists. In your opinion, does the US not ratifying UNCLOS undermine the credibility of its Indo-Pacific strategy? Rachel.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I guess to address that question first, I think that in many ways, UNCLOS does not actually address the core core tension between the United States and China. Which is about sort of the shifting balance of power in the region, and the anxieties that China feels over U.S. military presence in the South China Sea, in particular in the form of very frequent surveillance, 1,500 to 2,000 surveillance and reconnaissance operations along the Chinese coast every year, and frequent freedom of navigation operations near disputed islands. So this is more of a political and strategic competition. The Law of the Sea Convention is very ambiguous about matters related to military activities at sea, in part because these are very sensitive things that countries didn't want to pin themselves down on. And there were, of course, major disagreements between the major maritime powers, such as the United States and the Soviet Union, and more developing nations, including China, at the time the convention was negotiated. So, much of the United States sort of rhetoric about freedom of navigation and a rules-based maritime order is really based on promoting its vision of what maritime order should be, which includes free access for military vessels, and that's not really part of UNCLOS. So in other words, I think that yes, it's a problem. The United States has not ratified UNCLOS. The United States should ratify UNCLOS, but that doesn't really solve the underlying strategic tensions that exist. So, I think that in many ways, the United States has an overly militarized approach to maritime order, where we need to be thinking instead in terms of more cooperative security instead of conducting unilateral freedom of navigation operations that don't really do much good. And I guess then this gets back to, I guess, maybe a response to some of the points made earlier, which is that the danger in assuming a Cold War-like framework for the Asia Pacific is that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And in many ways, the United States over the last decade has become much more engaged in the South China Sea disputes, has taken much more of an explicit position in those, and it hasn't moderated China's behavior. In many ways, it's driven China to sort of double down on its claims and, adopt a more aggressive approach. So, I have a concern that adopting this approach is more reactive than really strategic, and that a more comprehensive strategy would consider how do we shape China's behavior, since the reality of China's economic and military power is not going away. How do you shape China's behavior in ways that is less concerning, less bullying towards Southeast Asian neighbors? And I think that, some of the remarks that Natalie made about Indonesia's approach, I think offer a really instructive model for how Canada could go about doing that better.
Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we're running out of time as we're on a tight schedule, and the panel needs to end right now. But I want to use these remaining seconds to really thank all of you for providing such great presentations on allies' perspectives on the pivot. And hopefully we can continue these conversations via other means. But thank you very much, and I'll leave it up to you, Jonathan, to navigate us towards the next session.
Merci beaucoup, Stéphanie. Merci infiniment à tous les conférenciers. C'était vraiment un panel.
Thank you very much, Stéphanie. Thank you to all the speakers. This was a fascinating panel that set the table for what comes next and for the second panel that we will have after lunch.
The Network for Strategic Analysis is very pleased that our next guest has accepted to deliver the keynote address. Commodore Angus Topshee is a naval warfare officer in the Royal Canadian Navy. He is currently the commander of the Canadian Pacific Naval Fleet. He has deployed in ships around the world, and today he will discuss the US rebalancing in Asia from a Canadian perspective. Following his presentation, Commodore Topshee will, of course, answer your questions, so do not hesitate to write down your questions. So, Commodore, thank you so much for being with us today. I know that you have a very tight schedule, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It is absolutely a pleasure for me to speak to you today. I'll just work on sharing my screen and see if I can. Right, so hopefully you can see the slides in front of you. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am coming to you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, and we're very grateful for our great relationship with those two First Nations. I also really enjoyed listening to the first panel, and I will do my best as a naval officer to provide my perspective as a practitioner in the area. I will attempt not to make this all about China and all about the Navy and the military, but of course, being someone who is a naval officer based in the Pacific, that is obviously probably going to be difficult to do. And so I think it's very clear from, as you look at the region, as you've listened to the previous panel, there were a lot of really good reasons, politically, economically, militarily, for why the US decided it needed to do a rebalance to the Pacific. I think there is no doubt about the growing strategic importance of the region, that the rise of China was certainly a factor in all of this. And, I think there's a lot we could talk about exactly why and how this has happened, but I thought the panelists did an excellent job of talking about some of the implications and history of that. So instead, I prefer to start by going back and taking a look at a little bit of the history from a much deeper and longer perspective about why was it that we felt we needed to start or to even have this rebalance. And so this chart to me highlights just sort of that for really most of the 20th century, you can see that the economic center of gravity for the world was centered in the North Atlantic. It's not surprising as you consider we had 2 world wars in the 20th century, fought largely in Europe, though clearly an important Pacific theater in the Second World War. And then it was into the Cold War competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, economic power clearly resonant in those 2 countries as well as in Europe. And so naturally, we saw a real emphasis on the North Atlantic relationship, on that sort of European perspective, that Western perspective. And I think that that plus the importance of the Middle East in terms of the supply of oil to the world was really why we felt as though that was where most of our attention was focused. And then breaking away from that and finding a way to change that paradigm became an important thing. And that led to this idea of the pivot to Asia or a rebalance. And I think the Americans really talked about it in terms of language to try and change the narrative to reflect the reality. And so what I'd like to do is talk a bit about, rather than the language that we use and the implications, talk a bit about the reality. And that really starts with the economies. And you can quibble with which particular measure of world economic power you use, and whether it's GDP, purchasing power parity, or whatever it might be. That will change the ordinals a little bit, but the relative importance and power of the Asia-Pacific region becomes clear in all of this. And as you can see in this slide, there's no doubting the economic importance of the Asia-Pacific region. Europe's still very important, and clearly the United States, the dominant power in the world, though China's rising quickly to challenge that. And I think that this, as you look at the economy, and then follow it up with a look at the world's populations, where again, you can see clearly Asia front and center. And in fact, in this view, you can't even find the Middle East on the slide. And so a lot of it, when we think about what was the US getting after when they talked in terms of the pivot language, was really trying to get away from this idea that the bulk of their military and diplomatic attention was really focused into the Middle East, into the legacy of the Cold War, into European areas, and that wasn't reflecting the growing economic importance, the political importance, the population center, of Asia Pacific. And so I think that really, for me, is what informs the US decision to try and do that. And so now what I'd like to do is to turn to, from a practitioner's perspective, as from a Navy perspective, why is this a natural decision? And then what are the implications? And so for me, it starts with an understanding of the geography of the region. Very clearly, when you look at this map, there's no mistaking the fact that there's a lot of water in the world. I also think, and I've long been an advocate, that this is the only map in Canada that we should really be using when we look at the globe as a whole. Our traditional North Atlantic centric map, puts the Americas over on the left-hand side, and the Pacific, despite the fact it's the largest ocean in the world, quickly becomes something that is at the margins, that's forgotten. And the connection of the North America to Asia, the rim of the Pacific, the size of that sphere really gets lost in all of that. The other thing I think you really take away from this particular map is that Asia and the Asia-Pacific region, or Indo-Asia-Pacific as it's become to be called, because you can really see the linkage between the Indian Ocean into the Pacific Ocean in this conception, but it is a maritime theater. So while Asia might be the largest landmass in the world, the reality is that this is an area that is connected by the sea, that is dependent upon the sea, and that in many places, the relationships between the countries have a huge component to the sea. It draws a tremendous amount of its food from the sea. Most of its resources travel by sea. And so this is, in my mind, very much a maritime theater. And so it's important to conceive of it in that way. And so naturally, when you talk about the pivot, one of the things that's featured in that is, 60% of the US Navy will be based in the Pacific. And so it is, that pivot was even expressed in naval terms. And that's not to say that the deployment of the rotational Marine force to Darwin is not a significant part of that. It certainly is. But I think most of the conception of the pivot was really seen for the US as something that was predominantly American. And the Marines very much are part of that, still being part of the Department of the Navy in the US.
Sorry, sir, I've taken control of your slides and we weren't seeing the slides change. So if you can just say next slide, please, when you want it.
All right. I'm sorry, I'll go back then to where I can see it. So, right. So yeah, so if you've gone to the slides, then sorry, I will jump on from this slide of the economy. And apologies for that. I guess my video has also stopped, it seems. Right, so just catching back up, and as you can see on this particular slide, back here to the relative size of the population of the world, where clearly, again, as I said, the Middle East not even really represented on this slide. It is because of the significance in terms of where the world's people are. Clearly, you see the importance of Asia. Go on to the next slide, please, Adam. So I already covered a lot. So this is the map of the world that I prefer because it is centered around the Pacific. You can see the sheer scale of the Pacific Ocean. You can see that it links the continents of North and South America, of Oceania, of Australia, of Asia, and then as well, as was expressed in talking about Indonesia as the fulcrum between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, just the interrelationship, how easy it is to access one from the other. And so that's why often now we think of this region as the Indo-Asia Pacific region. Moving on to the next slide, just to express the geography and to give you a sense of the scope of things in a different way, I think I find this particular presentation to be very useful because it highlights the distances involved. And you can see that from Halifax to Portsmouth, 2,500 nautical miles, a much smaller distance than getting across the Pacific to Tokyo at 4,200 nautical miles. But what's interesting from a Canadian naval point of view is that both of those distances, though they represent transocean journeys, are shorter than departing Halifax or Esquimalt and getting to our Naval Forward Operating Base in Nanisivik. And so for the Canadian Navy, we are necessarily an expeditionary service because to go anywhere from our main ports requires a tremendously long journey, and we are often operating into austere environments or places where we don't have easy sources of supply and all of the rest. So this is one of those key facts that drives our Navy's conception of ourselves as a necessarily blue water Navy, and one that is designed for expeditionary operations, even when we are responding in a domestic context. Moving on to the next slide, please. And so I find this slide really useful because those two circles show you how far a ship can travel in 7 days from Halifax or Esquimalt. And so when you talk about the US Navy rebalancing to the Pacific and putting 60% of its forces into the Pacific, one of the key reasons for that decision was to recognize that the Pacific's a large ocean to cross, and so forward basing becomes particularly important. But the reason why you still see, a lot of the U.S. naval forces based on the East Coast is, as you can see from the circle from Halifax, a fleet that's based out of Halifax can still reach large and important parts of the world in a relatively quick amount of time. And so as I go on to the next slide, you start to see the importance of having forces forward deployed. And so I am caution, I am not suggesting that the Canadian Navy is going to be based out of Guam, Curacao, or Sicily. These are just ports that we have gone to resupply out of. And what I want to highlight with this slide is the fact that we do have a ship continuously deployed on Operation Reassurance with the Standing NATO Maritime Group 1 over in Europe. And the reason for that is because a ship deployed with that task group is able to respond within that circle centered on Sicily in a relatively short period of time. We also right now have 3 ships deployed down to Operation Carib, which is the Joint Interagency Task Force South mission, anti-drug mission on both sides of the Central American Peninsula, and working with our partners and allies down there to try and stop the flow of drugs. Those ships, by virtue of the fact that they're located in that area, can then also respond to that part, though that is a mission that we do for roughly about 150 days a year. And then finally, at least 2 ships a year from the Canadian Pacific Fleet will deploy into East Asia, into that region. I've shown Guam because that is a major American naval base. And as you can see, having a ship deployed into that region means that it is available to respond much more quickly to world events over there. Of note, it is almost a month for a ship to depart from Esquimalt and get all the way down into Singapore and around to India. And so there's a significant time component to any response in the Pacific, and that forward presence becomes particularly important, not just for the Canadian Navy, but for any Navy that chooses to operate in the region. And that is one advantage that China will, and the other resident powers in the region will always have, is that obviously they're in their home waters and their ability to sustain their operations is greatly simplified by easy access to their home ports and home bases. Next slide, please. And so as I talk about navies, I'll switch now to looking at the regional navies. And one of the things that really drives the understanding of this region is just the growth in the size of the Chinese Navy recently. You can see in red just how many battle force ships the Chinese Navy has produced. By some measures, they are now arguably larger than the US Navy. This is one of those things, as a naval officer, there's a difference between size and power. The US Navy still centered around 11 carrier strike groups and a number of expeditionary strike groups. Is a much more powerful power projection Navy, but there is no doubting that the Chinese Navy has risen to a level where they are most likely by any measure the second most powerful Navy in the world, and arguably on track to become the most powerful Navy in the world. And so this is the conception of it in terms of the number of ships. If you go to the next slide, please. It's important also to think about a fleet is not just how many ships there are, but how old are these ships. So in the Chinese case, many of their ships, you can see on the left-hand side how rapidly the modern component of their fleet has grown. And on the right-hand side, in terms of tonnage, you can see that for quite a long time, until very recently, the US were building more tons of ships, a lot of their carriers and amphibious groups and a regular production of their Arleigh Burke class ships. Made sure that they, by tonnage terms, they were, quite large. You can see that the Chinese now, with an emphasis on aircraft carrier production, on amphibious ship production, a continued drumbeat of cruiser, destroyer, and frigate production, have now surpassed the US in terms of that rate of production of their Navy. Moving on to the next slide, please. And so, I think it's useful to expand the lens out and look at the US and Chinese Navy in comparison to other navies around the world. And what's really striking about this slide is two things. Is first, just the sheer size of the US and Chinese naval buildup compared to that of other navies. And then the second thing that I really note about this slide is the fact that the 4 of the other countries shown on the slide are from the Indo-Asia Pacific region. And then of course is the UK and France, both of whom are deploying carrier strike groups into the region this year as a demonstration of the fact that they also have a significant power projection Navy capability and believe that this is a region where their navies need to be showing their flag and showing their presence. So moving on to the next slide. I wanted to talk a bit about, so what do you do with navies? And so this is an interesting thing. So, navies obviously go out, they represent the country's interests, and then as they operate, they're really a signal of concern, of capability, of presence. And so this graph here shows the number of Chinese state-owned vessels that have been present in red inside the territorial seas of the Senkaku Islands, and then in blue inside the contiguous zone. That's the zone from 12 to 24 miles where nations have the ability to have some law enforcement provisions to ensure that they can enforce their rights within their territorial sea. Obviously, a dramatic pickup around September of 2012. And of course, that's when the Japanese government nationalized the Senkaku Islands. And so immediately you see a response from China with government vessels demonstrating their presence, effectively it's a freedom of navigation. And so I find it is always useful to look at freedom of navigation as not just something that the United States and others do, but all nations practice this by way of indicating their perspective and saying, no, we don't accept this. And so by our presence, we're going to demonstrate that we do not accept the, this territorial perspective that you've offered, whatever country that may be. And so the interesting thing about freedom of navigation response is that obviously from the Japanese government perspective, every time a Chinese vessel goes into their waters around the Senkaku, they will want to respond to show that they are acknowledging it. So that's a presence of some sort. And the same thing is done, any Canadian ship or any allied ship that has traveled through the South China Sea will inevitably pick up a People's Liberation Army Navy ship from China as they're transiting through. That just is an escort. It's just there checking out what you're doing and signaling that, yeah, we see you here. And it's common by other navies. As we go through the Strait of Taiwan, for example, a Taiwanese ship will come out and will effectively shadow a Canadian Navy ship as it goes through, joining the PLAN ship as it goes through. Now, the consequence of all of these actions where you're going around the world and you're maintaining this presence at sea is a very high operational tempo. And in fact, that's one of the reasons China has built up so many ships, is to make sure that they can sustain this very high operational tempo. And if you go to the next slide, there are real consequences to a high operational tempo when you don't have enough ships. And so here you see up in the top left, the Fitzgerald, and the bottom right, the McCain. 2 ships where 17 US sailors were lost in these 2 incidents of collisions at sea, not due to enemy action, but due to the fact that the US Navy was pushing the 7th Fleet so hard they didn't have time to maintain the standards of training and experience that they really needed to avoid errors and incidents at sea. And these had fatal consequences, caused the US Navy to take a long, hard look at their training mechanisms. But one of the critical things that came out of this is that the operational tempo was driving them to a point where they were taking, the level of risks that they were accepting were untenable and had these consequences. And I think that's a really important thing for us to be aware of, is that, there's a real tendency for policy leaders and political leaders to use navies. The navies are the simple thing. Let's, for the US, let's send a carrier strike group there. Let's do some more freedom of navigation. Let's have a continuous presence. Well, this puts real demands and pressures on navies around the world to sustain that presence. And as you can see, it can have there's a price to that. Next slide, please. And so the other thing that the US Navy did during the pivot is they looked at their command and control structure. And I had the unique opportunity to be based in a US combatant command, part of the NORAD staff, which is also the US Northern Command staff down in Colorado Springs. At one of the points where, as the Obama administration was changing over to the Trump administration, and Korea was still a very active theater where there was real concern in the US that they were going to have to actually fight a war on the Korean Peninsula. And they were starting to plan seriously for what that would look like. And one of the recognitions they had is that the complexity of command and control in the Asia Pacific region, and if 7th Fleet is fully occupied fighting on the Korean Peninsula, how would they manage the rest of that theater so that other nations didn't take advantage of their preoccupation? So the US had experimented with this concept of 3rd Fleet Forward, where the 7th Fleet would focus on one area and 3rd Fleet based out of San Diego, would deploy its forces and command and control them on the other side of the world. That's actually sort of the World War II model. More recently, in December, they announced that they were looking at standing up the 1st Fleet based in the Indian Ocean, with the headquarters potentially in Singapore or Australia. Now, yes, that was announced under the Trump administration, and will it be carried through? Because it's yet to happen. This is a U.S. Navy initiative, so I think that something along these lines will come, because what this really represents is the U.S. Navy trying to grapple with how are we going to effectively command and control operations across this vast theater as the number of ships increase, and how are we going to make sure that we avoid the situation, or at least we are able to manage the operational tempo in a way that reduces the risk of an incident, whether it's an inadvertent experience with another regional power or an accident at sea. They're really keen to make sure that their command and control structure is effective. The other feature of this, which also comes out of the work they did when they thought they might have to go to war in the Korean Peninsula, was they realized that even the US, with its vast resources of its military, didn't have enough capacity to deal with a full conflict, especially when it was talking in peer or near peer terms, and that allies were critically important for the capabilities that they could bring. And so part of building effective networks of allies and real partnerships meant that you had people who were the commanders of their 7th Fleet based out of Japan, or 3rd Fleet based out of San Diego, could build real relationships. And again, that comes back to 1st Fleet being able to build relationships around India and the Indian Ocean and work all of that, and really raise the level of cooperation with allies. And that, for Canada, has played out in the sense that, as you heard from previous panelists about how Malabar had gained additional importance. That's the Quads exercise based out of India. There are a number of other exercises that are run with Japan and the United States, Australia and the United States, India and the United States, that had historically been just really bilateral exercises where those navies work together. Increasingly, we're seeing a real push from the US to expand those exercises, and there's a difference in the exercises. There are some exercises, such as Rim of the Pacific, which is the biennial exercise on even-numbered years, the largest maritime exercise in the world. That's really sort of a lowest common denominator exercise where the emphasis is on participation and making it as easy as possible for as many nations of the world to participate. And RIMPAC these days is attracting about 30 different nations from actually around the world. And then there's, in contrast to that, you have other exercises such as Talisman Sabre, Annual X, which are focused on a smaller group of participants and really close allied cooperation to become effective fighting at the higher end of warfare in preparation for something at the peer or near peer. And again, I caution, it's too often it seems as though military people are, leaning towards war. I think we don't pay enough attention to deterrence, and effective deterrence begins by demonstrating that you are capable of fighting. And in fact, the aspect of deterrence that I prefer to emphasize is the denial of benefit aspect of that. Not that, if you do something to us, there'll be incredible consequences. It's that, no, we are prepared for any action you might take, and you will not be able to achieve your aim because we will be able to defend against that aim. And that is often the intent of our exercises, to demonstrate that type of deterrence. So I'll go on to the next slide, and I'll turn now to a look more specifically at what all of this has meant for the Royal Canadian Navy. And I go back to a paper written by one of my predecessors, Commodore retired Eric Leary in 2015, where he looked at the Asia Pacific region, recognized the growing importance and the recognition that it was growing in importance in Canada, a sort of a reaction to the pivot as well. And he came up with some really interesting things and did a bit of a history study and showed that we in Canada had actually been fairly well engaged into the region. In fact, we used to deploy up to 4 ships in a task group, what was known as a West Ploy. Pretty much every second year, we would send this task group of ships around the Pacific to show the Canadian flag, to do all of those defense diplomacy missions where we would support Canadian interests and build partnerships in the region. Unfortunately, due to the size of our fleet and the retirement of some vessels, those exercises and the midlife refit of the Halifax class meant that we didn't have the number of ships needed to sustain that level of investment. And so if we go to the next slide, what you'll see is we moved from the situation where, we had this 3 or 4 ship task group up in the top left, all Canadian, going around with a Canadian command and control and a Canadian commodore. In fact, my predecessors all did these types of operation. Unfortunately, 2 of the 3 ships showing up in the top left are now decommissioned and dismantled. And so now our model is much more down in the bottom right, where you see HMCS Ottawa working with 2 Japanese ships. And we're now working to integrate on an individual ship basis to work with other partners and navies around the world. And that's a particularly significant photo because that's from a KADEX, which is a Japan-Canada exercise, one of our first bilateral exercises, and getting the Japanese to a place where they were willing to start to work with non-American partners was a significant step. In the past, we'd only ever worked with them when it was sort of as an adjunct to something else the US was doing. And we're now also a part of the Annual X series of exercises, which is that higher end exercise. And it's great to have the opportunity to work with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. They're a very capable group, and to get their perspective and to see how they operate has been a tremendous value to us. Next slide, please. So I thought it would be useful to share a little bit more about that Ottawa deployment. And so we did deploy HMCS Winnipeg to the same region last year, but just because how COVID affected that deployment and limited our ability to interact anywhere, and really with the ship in isolation, I thought I'd go back to Ottawa's deployment from 2019, that one where the photo was taken from, and to talk about what types of deployments we've been doing, because this is fairly indicative of what we have done and what we hope to get back to doing, once the COVID allows us to be more interactive ashore. And so you can see that the focus of the deployment for a lot of it was what we call Operation Neon. That's Canada's contribution to the sanctions enforcement against North Korea, where we try and make sure that for example, ship-to-ship transfers of fuel to break the embargo, we detect those. We don't actually interdict them. What happens there is that we take photos like the one you see of them, we document what's happened, and then we send that off for diplomats to the United Nations to start to work with the shipping companies, to start to work with the flag states and everything else to prevent that type of arrangement happening so that the embargo holds against North Korea. And then up in the top right, you can also see that we visited 4 countries and operated with partner navies around the region. The one that is particularly of note is Vietnam. We did a port visit with Vietnam. We worked with the Vietnamese Navy, and we've been able to build a pretty good relationship by returning regularly to Vietnam as we can to sort of deepen our ties there and to look for opportunities to cooperate more closely and to better understand each other's regional perspective. It is a joint operation as well. I'll note the CP-140 Aurora, one of our maritime patrol aircraft, was also participating in this and continues to participate regularly in OPNEON. And you can also see down in the right that Ottawa participated in CADEX, ANNULEX, and Pacific Vanguard. So that's more of those exercises around the Pacific, which are focused on building partner capacity and creating and sustaining that narrative and demonstration of the free and open Indo-Pacific region. Next slide, please. And so this was a necessarily brief and rapid overview of, from my perspective as a practitioner, of what the U.S. pivot has meant in terms for both the U.S. Navy, for the region more importantly, and specifically for the Royal Canadian Navy. So I'll end with this photo, which I particularly enjoy. This is taken from HMCS Winnipeg's deployment last year. And I love it because it shows the commitment we made, our Cyclone helicopter, the Aurora in Winnipeg. And it reminds you that the sea is a challenging environment. This is taken from one of the ship's small boats to try and capture the fact that all three of those assets were deployed at the same time. And I also think that as I look at this from a Canadian Navy perspective, this is often how I feel looking at the rest of the navies of the world, just overwhelmed by the sale of everything around and hoping that, should everything go badly, that we just survive. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Commodore Topshi. I would like to remind the audience to ask the questions in the Q&R section in the bottom of the screen. I do have a few questions for you, Commodore. The first one, to go back to the US pivot, is the following. Will the pivot lead Canada to balance or rebalance the deployment of its fleet? So in equal proportion in the east and in the west of Canada. So that's the first question.
Yeah, so from a deployment perspective, we are already balanced. My counterpart on the East Coast deploys on average 2 ships a year, 2 frigates a year to the Opération Assurance, that mission in Europe. I deploy 2 ships a year. This year it'll be Calgary and Winnipeg to what we call Op Projection and Operation Neon into Asia Pacific. Right now, our fleet, 7 of our frigates are based in Halifax. 5 of them are based here in Esquimalt. Should we break that up 6 and 6? The reality is, given the age of our fleet, we're now, all of our frigates are 25 years old. 2 of them are permanently in long-term maintenance at the Davie Yard in Montreal and at the Irving Yard in Halifax. One of them is in maintenance all the time as they cycle through maintenance at the Victoria Shipyard here in Esquimalt. So really, when you factor in the fact that 2 of the East Coast ships are in a deep maintenance period and 1 of the West Coast ships are, effectively we are balanced in terms of the frigates, the main combatant. What the ultimate balance will be for the Canadian surface combatant as we get 15 of those, hard to say, but more likely, the reality quite simply is that from Halifax, you can get most places in the world more quickly than you can from Victoria or from Esquimalt. And since we view ourselves as a globally deployable Navy, basing more ships in Halifax actually makes a lot of sense. I can get to the Middle East, my counterpart on the East Coast can get to the Middle East more quickly than I can. It's nearly a month and a half for a ship to leave from Esquimalt and to get all the way into the Arabian Gulf, whereas it's just about a month, slightly less than a month for a ship to get there from Halifax. And so by that metric, Halifax is a more centrally located base. And that's the other reason why you may never see a completely equal split. It's not the relative importance of the 2 sides. A lot of it's driven by geography.
Thank you. And considering the limited size of our fleet, what should we focus on? Should we focus on the Pacific? Should we focus on the Middle East, on the Arctic, on Europe? Can you tell us a little bit about this sort of strategic thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge that Canada has always faced is that it's really difficult for us to find a natural region of the world. People love to compare us to Australia because we are relatively similar historical backgrounds, size, economic power. And we're often jealous of, Australia knows exactly what they're doing. They're building it. But their strategic situation is quite different. They are, down in a part of the region. They've experienced different threats through their history, whereas we are located in a place that for much of our history has been actually quite safe and quite nice. It's next to the most powerful nation in the world with the United States, and so unless that's a war with them, things are really quite secure. 3 oceans around us, and then we're far from everywhere else. If you look, go back to the maps of the world, and you see that there's no natural region for Canada to engage in. And I think that's one of the challenges we've hit, is that we can really pick and choose where we want to engage, and that leaves the government to pick the right strategic direction, the right point of emphasis for us. So from a Navy point of view, our task, I think, has to begin by the first thing we need to do is make sure that we are secure back here in Canada. So whether that's, and you can see that consistently through Canadian defense policy. And so our first task has to be the ability to protect our waters in all 3 oceans. And so that has driven the fleet to create the Harry DeWolf class, which is now operating up north. And we're really looking forward to seeing that class come to fruition with 6 of those ships that will be spending time up north each year, and allowing us to truly make sure that no matter what might happen in that region of the world, we have the capacity to respond. And then to make sure that our fleet overall is able to first understand what's happening in our waters, and second, then take action as necessary. Most of the time, thankfully, the threats are such that we're really enabling other government departments, Fisheries and Oceans, Transport Canada, Environment and Climate Change Canada, to support their mandates. And so we're really just supporting that. And then finally, it's overseas deployments. Whatever we do overseas is driven by the political imperative. So a lot of it is driven by the NATO alliance, and that commitment to op reassurance is due to the fact that after 2014, there was a recognition that NATO existed for a reason, and that we needed to demonstrate that alliance commitment was tangible. And for us, that has been that continuous presence. And that has the added benefit of having a ship that is ready to go anytime and react. And so, in fact, if you go back to September 11th, the first ship into the Arabian Gulf, and into the Arabian Sea and ready to respond after that was HMCS Charlottetown, which had been assigned to that NATO standing task group, and was able to rapidly redeploy to the higher priority mission at that time. And so that's one of the reasons that drives us to have this presence around the world, and that's part of the reason for op projection, is to make sure that we have a presence in Asia. We're ready to react, whether that's at the disaster relief, humanitarian assistance end of the spectrum, or to assist an ally or partner in conflict. It doesn't matter, we're ready for either side.
Thank you. We now have a question from Jean-Daniel Marcoux. Compared to the Pacific theater, what is the Navy capacity for the Arctic, and how is it linked to the Pacific strategy, if at all?
So the challenge for me in the Pacific, and what you will see ultimately in the basing of the Harry DeWolf class, is that 4 of them will be based out of Halifax, and 2 of them based here in Esquimalt once they're all delivered. That's because it's a lot shorter and easier to get into the Pacific, into the Arctic from Halifax. It's just over 2,500 nautical miles up to Nanisivik. From Halifax, whereas for me to get a ship all the way around Alaska and into the Arctic is a much more challenging. It's nearly 4,000 nautical miles just to the start of that. So that doesn't mean we don't do it. We have deployed our maritime coastal defense vessels up to Inuvik a couple of years ago. It's a larger muscle movement in the sense it's not something we can't do, but because of the amount of time it takes, it detracts from other things that we want to do with that. And that's really, when you have a relatively small fleet like ours, it's not that we can't do things. A lot of the time it's the opportunity cost of doing things. And so to deploy a ship to the Arctic from here, I can, but that will come at the expense of my ability to support Op Carib, my ability to put a ship into Asia Pacific. And I'll also point out that we have operated our frigates up north. They are not ice strengthened. In fact, a frigate hull is thinner than commercial standard because it's not designed to be, it's designed to a different level. So ice is one of those things that we like to keep away from in frigates, and that we design ships around it. It's not that we can't operate up there, it just constrains the ability for us to operate. We have to be much more careful about how quickly we go, where we go, when we travel. But the other good news is that so far, there's no need for a warfighting presence up in the Arctic Ocean or in the regions. And I will emphasize, a lot of the times, if there was a naval threat up there, the appropriate response for us is probably not going to be a ship, but some other capability through the rest of the joint capabilities of the Canadian Armed Forces.
You mentioned during your presentation that Canada is now working directly with the Japanese fleet. And I was curious to learn more about the sort of common exercises or the interoperability of these exercises, especially with the US. How is it that we are integrating with the US in the Pacific with respect to the numerous challenges that you named in your presentation?
Yeah, and so one of the capabilities the Canadian Navy has worked very hard at is our interoperability. And so we were the first ship going back to HMCS, the first Navy back to HMCS Regina in 1997 to actually a U.S. task group where we were fully integrated into that and actually took the place of an American ship. So they were going to deploy 3 ships. Instead, they only sent 2, and the 3rd ship was HMCS Regina. Because we had the level of interoperability, we could seamlessly exchange data and communications. We were able to exchange classified data at a high level as well. And they had sufficient trust in our capabilities that they felt that they didn't need their 3rd ship. We've integrated with American carrier strike groups as well, again, replacing those ships. You now see other navies around the world, the Royal Navy, the Australian Navy, also focused on doing these things. And increasingly, we've created this interoperability of fleets such that when we're out there, we are able to communicate seamlessly, that the picture that we have in our ship is immediately transmitted to the other ships. What they're seeing is transmitted back to us. And should there be a conflict, we would be able to engage cooperatively. So I think that's a real thing. The other key thing that comes from working with other navies is learning how they operate. And you know, you've heard a lot about diversity, and that diversity of perspective. A Japanese officer will come at a problem, see a problem, will understand a region differently than a Canadian or an American will. And every chance that we get to work with them, it helps us to see the world through their eyes, to appreciate different things. And so one of the things that my staff has learned is that I often will emphasize that, you know, when we're trying to understand how to solve a problem in the Canadian Navy, deal with a sort of what type of uniforms would we want to get, what sort of standards for firefighting and stuff, we're increasingly looking to say, well, how did the Japanese Navy address this issue? How did the Indian Navy address this issue? Because we're finding that a lot of the Western navies, we all tend to view the problem the same way. Sometimes the solutions that we're seeing in navies that we haven't traditionally worked very closely with, like the Japanese Navy, are actually the ones that are even more fruitful for us. And so there's a real benefit that's come from working with the Japanese Navy, and to see the level of professionalism of that force and the tremendous capability. I think, you know, the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force has a bit of a misleading name. They are a very, very capable Navy that, for a number of reasons related to their history and their constitution, they tend to downplay what they are capable of. Yeah, they're a robust partner, and we would definitely, were we ever in a conflict in the Pacific, I would be eager to fight alongside the Japanese because of the level of capability that they bring.
A question from Maxime Fortier. With the increased costs and delays, and as well as the need to replace the Victoria class in the long term, do you think that the Navy runs the risk of facing a capability gap? Will this prevent it from being deployed effectively in the Indo-Pacific?
So we're always going to face a challenge deploying submarines across the Indo-Pacific, because the speed of a deployment of a submarine is about half that of a frigate. So if you remember the graphs I showed of how far a ship can move in 7 days, for a submarine, that's 14 days. And as you can imagine, getting a submarine across the Pacific is a challenging exercise. And that's why, you know, and you saw with Shikumi's deployment was 197 days. And part of that was based out of Japan, working with our partners there. And that's because of that, just the sheer amount of time it gets to go across. That's always going to be a factor, especially when we have a fleet of only 4 submarines. Whether there'll be a capability gap, we've begun the process of looking at submarine replacement options. These are complicated. Submarines are even more complex than warships, and you can read in the OAG report and the PBO report just how complex those procurements are. So a submarine procurement takes it to another order of magnitude, and I'm certainly looking with interest at Australia's experience as they go through that, purchasing their 12 attack class submarines. So I'm confident. You know, we are aware of the challenges that we face. We're working hard to make sure that we have an effective submarine replacement procured, prior to the end of life of the Victoria class, but in the meantime, we're going through a Victoria class modernization that will ensure that these subs, which are among the most capable diesel electric submarines in the world, remain effective until that replacement class comes.
Maybe one general question, and then we'll end our discussion. What's it like to deal with the increased tensions between the US and China from your perspective, from the Navy perspective?
Yeah, it's very interesting. We're always concerned that we understand what's happening in and around us. And one of the concerns that I think I have coming out of there is to be conscious of the fact that, you know, what we don't want to be is, we want to be aware of our environments all of the time. And so as the tension between China and the US builds, we need to be aware of, you know, any potential for a conflict between the two of them and how that would impact the two of us. But at the same time, we don't want to drive a narrative where you know, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We see China as a threat, so they become a threat. We have to be very realistic. They've taken a lot of actions recently that I think call into question, you know, their commitment to a rules-based international order. But at the same time, you know, as any rising power does, there's different paths that they can choose. And, you know, I would hope that they would choose a path that takes them more along the path that the US followed as they were the rising power, looking at the mid-naval might of Britain and the rest, rather than the path that Japan chose in a similar situation. So our goal really is to be open to working with anyone prepared to work with us, anyone who shares our values and interests, obviously very responsive to the Government of Canada direction across the board, but at the same time, very cautious, very aware of the environment and the fact that the world is a dangerous place. And as 2020 has proven, things can change very, very rapidly in unexpected directions.
Commodore Topshi, thank you so much for your presentation, for your fascinating presentation with amazing graphs and figures. I did learn quite a lot from it, and I'm sure that it's the same for people who have listened to your presentation. Thank you very much once again, Commodore. And now we'll have the lunch break. The second panel will start at 1 p.m. So hopefully we'll all return in an hour from now. So have a good lunch, everyone. Thanks.